October 23rd, 1942, 9:47 p.m. The Savoy Ballroom, Lenox Avenue. Bumpy Johnson stood face to face with Brigadier General Theodore Morrison, a decorated combat officer who'd commanded 3,000 men across two theaters of war, a man who'd never been challenged on American soil, a man who'd just called him something no black man in Harlem could let slide. Behind the general, 12 MP officers, sidearms holstered, batons ready. Behind Bumpy, 400 Harlem residents frozen mid-dance, the Chick Webb Orchestra silent for the first time that night, and every eye watching to see if the king of Harlem would bow to military brass. The smart play? Apologize. Walk away. Live to see tomorrow. Morrison had the United States Army behind him. One word from him, and Bumpy would disappear into a military stockade where Harlem's streets couldn't reach him. But what General Morrison didn't know was that Bumpy Johnson had spent 3 weeks preparing for exactly this moment. And in 17 seconds, he would deliver a message that would echo through military command posts from Fort Dix to the Pentagon. A message written in blood and delivered with a closed fist. This is the story of the night Bumpy Johnson made the United States Army blink first. To understand why Bumpy Johnson punched a general in front of 400 witnesses, you need to understand what Harlem was in 1942. The war had transformed the neighborhood into a powder keg. 30,000 Harlem men had enlisted or been drafted since Pearl Harbor. Their wives, mothers, and sisters worked double shifts in munitions factories and defense plants, producing 18% of the ammunition that crossed the Atlantic while earning 40% less than white workers doing identical jobs. And every Friday night, when white servicemen flooded into Harlem looking for jazz, liquor, and black women, tensions exploded. The military police didn't help. They rolled through in convoys of 6, always 6, with orders to maintain order in what they called the Colored Entertainment District. In practice, that meant cracking skulls first and asking questions never. In the previous 8 months, MPs had hospitalized 23 Harlem residents. Not one soldier faced charges. Brigadier General Theodore Morrison was the worst of them. At 54 years old, Morrison was a relic of a different era, a man who'd learned his racism in the Jim Crow South and polished it in 27 years of military service. He'd been stationed at Fort Hamilton in Brooklyn since June, and he'd made it his personal mission to clean up Harlem's nightlife. His reputation preceded him. 11 bars shut down without due process, 46 arrests for disrespecting a federal officer, and one young man, James Parker, age 19, beaten so severely outside the Cotton Club that he'd lost vision in his left eye. Morrison did it all with impunity. Who was going to stop him? The NYPD looked the other way. The mayor's office called it wartime necessity. And Harlem's own leadership, ministers, businessmen, political bosses, counseled patience. Wait until after the war, they said. We can't afford to look unpatriotic. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't most men. At 35 years old, Bumpy controlled everything that mattered in Harlem. The numbers racket that employed 600 runners and generated $30,000 weekly. The protection network that kept independent businesses safe. And most importantly, the respect of people who had no reason to respect anyone. He'd built his reputation on a simple code. Protect the neighborhood, keep the violence surgical, and never, never let disrespect slide. Morrison had violated that code. The breaking point came on October 2nd, when MPs under Morrison's command raided Small's Paradise on 135th Street. They'd beaten 3 waiters unconscious, assaulted 2 female employees, and confiscated $4,000 in cash that never made it into evidence logs. The owner, a man named Edwin Smalls who'd run the club since 1925, called Bumpy from a hospital bed. He's going to keep doing this, Smalls said through broken teeth. Someone needs to stop him. Bumpy hung up the phone and made a decision that would change Harlem history. He was going to give General Morrison exactly what he was looking for. October 3rd, 1942, 2 p.m., Bumpy sat in the back room of Perkins Pool Hall on 147th Street with 5 men he trusted with his life. Morrison's pattern is predictable, Bumpy said, spreading a hand-drawn map of Harlem across the table. Every Friday, he starts at the Braddock Hotel bar at 8 p.m. 3 drinks, always 3. Then he makes rounds. The Cotton Club, Connie's Inn, and he always ends at the Savoy by 9:30. Why the Savoy? asked Illinois Gordon, Bumpy's oldest friend. Because it's the biggest. 400 people on a good night. He likes an audience. Bumpy circled the Savoy's location in red pencil. That's where we do it. Illinois leaned back. You're really going to hit a general. I'm going to make him swing first, Bumpy corrected. That's the difference. Over the next 3 weeks, Bumpy executed a plan that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with psychology. He paid 3 waitresses at Morrison's regular haunts $50 each to report the general's habits. Bumpy learned that Morrison drank Johnny Walker Red, always sat with his back to the wall, and got louder and more aggressive after his 3rd drink. More importantly, he learned that Morrison had a trigger. He couldn't stand being ignored by black staff. Bumpy met with Samuel Battle, the NYPD's first black police officer and now a lieutenant with quiet influence, at a church in Queens where no one would see them together. I can't protect you if you start this, Battle warned. I'm not asking you to protect me, Bumpy said. I'm asking you to make sure there's a record. Time-stamped. Witnesses. Everything documented. Battle studied him. You're planning something that needs documentation. I'm planning to defend myself. Publicly. Battle made a call. Within a week, 2 reporters, one from the Amsterdam News, one from the Pittsburgh Courier, received anonymous tips that something significant would happen at the Savoy on October 23rd. Both agreed to attend. Bumpy spread the word through his network that Friday, October 23rd, would be a special night at the Savoy. No details. Just come early, dress sharp, and watch. By 8 p.m. that Friday, the Savoy was packed with 400 people who sensed history brewing. Bumpy made sure General Morrison heard, through carefully placed gossip in the Braddock Hotel bar, that Bumpy Johnson himself would be at the Savoy that night, acting like he runs the place. For a man like Morrison, who viewed Harlem as occupied territory that needed a firm military hand, it was irresistible bait. October 23, 1942, 9:15 p.m. Bumpy arrived at the Savoy wearing a charcoal gray suit with a burgundy tie, no weapon visible, no crew surrounding him. Just one man, walking calmly through the crowd to a small table near the bandstand. He ordered a ginger ale. Waited. The Chick Webb Orchestra played Stompin' at the Savoy. Couples danced. Laughter filled the air. And then, at 9:38 p.m., the front doors banged open. General Theodore Morrison entered flanked by 12 military police officers in full uniform, nightsticks hanging from their belts, .45 caliber pistols holstered at their hips. The music continued. The dancing continued. But everyone in that room understood something was about to break. 9:41 p.m. Morrison scanned the room with the contempt of a man who viewed everything before him as beneath military jurisdiction. His eyes locked on Bumpy, seated alone, posture relaxed, ginger ale untouched. The general crossed the dance floor. His MPs fanned out behind him. The music played. Couples kept dancing. But the tension was a physical thing now, thick enough to choke on. Morrison stopped 3 feet from Bumpy's table. You're Bumpy Johnson. It wasn't a question. Bumpy looked up slowly, meeting Morrison's eyes with the calm of a man who'd faced worse than uniformed bullies. I am. I've been hearing your name, Morrison said. Hearing you think you run things up here. I don't think anything, General. I just live here. Morrison's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to black men meeting his eyes. Wasn't used to calm where he expected fear. You got a smart mouth for a, he used the word. The room went silent. The Chick Webb Orchestra's trumpets cut off mid-note. 400 people stopped dancing. Every eye turned to Bumpy Johnson, waiting to see if Harlem's king would swallow that poison or spit it back. Most men would have exploded, thrown the first punch, given Morrison exactly the excuse he needed to justify a beating, an arrest, a disappearance. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't most men. He stood slowly, deliberately, every movement calculated. Say that again, Bumpy said quietly. Say it louder, so everyone can hear what kind of man wears that uniform. Morrison stepped closer, emboldened by his MPs, by his rank, by a lifetime of saying whatever he wanted to black faces and watching them look away. You heard me, boy. You're a, he said it again. Louder. That's when Bumpy smiled. See, that's what I needed, Bumpy said. Witnesses. Morrison's brow furrowed. What? 400 people just heard a United States Army general use that word against an unarmed civilian in a public establishment. 2 newspaper reporters took notes. Bumpy gestured subtly toward the edges of the room where two men with notepads watched intently. So now everyone knows who started this. What General Morrison didn't know was that Bumpy had turned the entire Savoy ballroom into a courtroom, and Morrison had just testified against himself. Morrison's face flushed red. He reached for Bumpy's collar with his right hand, the first act of physical aggression, witnessed by hundreds. Bumpy's response was surgical. He slapped Morrison's hand away with his left. Morrison, drunk on 3 whiskeys and a lifetime of unchecked authority, swung his right fist at Bumpy's face. Bumpy ducked left. The punch sailed past his ear. And then Bumpy Johnson, in front of 400 witnesses, 12 military police officers, 2 newspaper reporters, and God himself, delivered a straight right hand that connected with General Theodore Morrison's jaw with the sound of a baseball bat hitting a watermelon. Morrison's head snapped back. His peaked cap flew off. His knees buckled. He dropped to the Savoy's wooden floor like a marionette with cut strings. The room exploded. The crowd roared, not with fear, but with the primal release of watching someone finally hit back. The MPs rushed forward, hands on their weapons. But Bumpy didn't run, didn't pull a weapon, didn't move at all. He stood over Morrison's unconscious body with his hands at his sides, palms open, visible to everyone. He swung first, Bumpy said calmly, projecting his voice to every corner of the room. 400 witnesses, 2 reporters, self-defense. The MPs froze. Because Bumpy was right. Every person in that ballroom had watched Morrison throw the first punch. Every person would testify that Bumpy had only defended himself. And if they arrested him now, if they beat him, shot him, dragged him away, it wouldn't be in the shadows. It would be in front of 400 Harlem residents who'd spent years watching the military police operate with impunity. The lead MP, a sergeant named Collins with 20 years of service, looked at his unconscious commander on the floor, looked at Bumpy Johnson standing calmly with open hands, looked at the crowd pressing closer, faces hard, daring them to start something they couldn't finish. Collins made a calculation. The same calculation officers have made throughout history when they realize they're outnumbered not by bodies, but by righteousness. "Get the general up," Collins said quietly to his men. "We're leaving." They lifted Morrison, still unconscious, blood running from his split lip, and carried him toward the door. Not one person in that crowd moved aside to let them pass easily. The MPs had to navigate through a sea of Harlem residents who stood their ground, making the soldiers squeeze through gaps that closed as quickly as they opened. It took 7 minutes to cross a floor that should have taken 30 seconds. That's when everyone understood the military didn't run Harlem. Harlem did. By 6 a.m. the next morning, every numbers runner, beautician, cab driver, porter, and minister in Harlem knew the story. Bumpy Johnson had punched a general in the face. The army had carried their officer out in shame, and not one person had been arrested. The Amsterdam News ran the story on page 1. Harlem man defends himself against military officer. No charges filed. The article quoted 12 witnesses who confirmed Morrison had used racial slurs and thrown the first punch. The Pittsburgh Courier went further, running an editorial. "When will our servicemen protect all Americans?" Within a week, the story reached Fort Hamilton's command structure. An investigation was quietly opened into Morrison's conduct. Not because the military cared about racial justice, but because Morrison had become a public relations disaster during a war that needed black support. Brigadier General Theodore Morrison was reassigned to a supply depot in rural Montana on November 8, 1942. He never commanded troops in combat again. He retired in 1945 without promotion, his career quietly ended by a single punch in a Harlem ballroom. The military police changed their patrol patterns. They still came to Harlem, but they came in smaller groups. They kept their batons holstered. They remembered that under the uniform, they were guests in someone else's neighborhood. But the real change was internal. 3 days after the incident, Bumpy sat in the same back room at Perkins Pool Hall where he'd planned the confrontation. Illinois Gordon sat across from him, shaking his head. "You realize you could have been shot, court-martialed, disappeared." Bumpy lit a cigarette, took a long drag. "I could have done nothing, too. Let him keep terrorizing us. Let Harlem keep swallowing disrespect because we were too afraid to choke on it. And if those MPs had opened fire, then 400 people would have seen the truth," Bumpy said quietly. "That's worth dying for." Illinois studied his friend. "You're not afraid of anything, are you?" "I'm afraid of plenty," Bumpy said. "I'm afraid of becoming the kind of man who lets bullies operate unchecked. I'm afraid of teaching the next generation that power only flows one direction. I'm afraid of dying with nothing changed." He crushed his cigarette out. Fear doesn't mean you don't act. It means you act despite it. The story spread beyond Harlem. Within months, it reached black servicemen stationed across the country and overseas. They carried it into mess halls and barracks, sharing it in whispers that grew into declarations. If Bumpy Johnson could punch a general and walk away, maybe we don't have to accept everything they tell us we have to accept. Decades later, veterans of the 92nd Infantry Division and the Tuskegee Airmen would recall hearing the story in 1943 and feeling something shift inside them. A recognition that dignity wasn't granted by authority, it was claimed by courage. Bumpy Johnson stood 5'9" and weighed 165 pounds. General Theodore Morrison commanded thousands, wore stars on his collar, and represented the most powerful military in human history. Yet on October 23, 1942, in front of 400 witnesses, the smaller man won. Not because he was stronger, but because he was smarter. He'd turned a barroom confrontation into a public trial. He'd made sure every punch was witnessed, documented, and justified. He'd given the military police a choice: start a riot they couldn't control, or retreat with whatever dignity they could salvage. They retreated, and in doing so, they sent a message that echoed through every precinct, patrol, and power structure that had grown comfortable terrorizing communities without consequence. There are places where your authority ends and the people's dignity begins. The punch itself lasted less than a second. The preparation took 3 weeks. The legend has lasted 84 years. Because real power isn't the uniform you wear or the weapon you carry. Real power is knowing exactly when to walk away and exactly when to throw the punch that changes everything. If you believe some things are worth fighting for no matter the odds, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories about people who refused to bow when everyone expected them to break. And drop a comment. What would you have done in Bumpy's position? Walk away or stand your ground? Next video, the night Bumpy Johnson sat down with Lucky Luciano and negotiated a deal that would make him untouchable, and why the Italian mob never forgot what happened in that room. Remember, they can take your money, your freedom, even your life. But they can't take your dignity unless you hand it to them. Bumpy Johnson never handed them a damn thing.